September 1945. A village outside Yokohama. The war was over, but hunger was just beginning. The wooden houses stood like skeletons against the gray sky, burnt, broken, held together by memory and stubbornness. The smell of ash still hung in the air weeks after the last fires had died, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and desperation. In the streets, women moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. They carried children who no longer cried. Children learned quickly that crying required energy, and energy required food, and food no longer existed. The rice was gone. The vegetables were gone. The fish markets stood empty, their wooden stalls bleached white by sun and salt. The docks where fishermen had once brought in the day's catch now held only broken boats and the memory of better times. The farms that surrounded the village had been stripped bare, not by the Americans, but by their own desperate hands. Every grain of rice, every root vegetable, every scrap that could sustain life had been consumed weeks ago. What remained was a slow, grinding starvation that killed the very old and the very young first, then worked its way through everyone else with methodical cruelty. People ate grass. They ate bark stripped from trees. They boiled leather shoes until they became soft enough to chew. They caught rats and considered themselves lucky. Old men sat in doorways and stared at nothing, their hands trembling with weakness, their minds returning to better times that seemed now like dreams from someone else's life. Young mothers aged a decade in a month, their bodies consuming themselves to produce milk that no longer came, watching their babies fade like flowers in winter. Mrs. Takahashi held her daughter against her chest. The child was 4 years old. She weighed less than she had at 2. Her arms were sticks wrapped in gray skin. Her stomach was swollen with the peculiar cruelty of starvation, the body retaining fluid because it no longer knew how to function properly. Her eyes were too large for her face, giving her the look of a small animal, something fragile and doomed. Mrs. Takahashi had not eaten in 3 days. She had given her last handful of rice to her daughter, cooked in water that tasted of rust and desperation. It was not enough. It was never enough. She knew her daughter was dying. She knew she was dying. She simply did not know which of them would go first, and in her darkest moments she prayed that she would die first, so she would not have to watch her child go. The radio had told them the Americans were coming. Not to fight. The fighting was finished. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had spoken, his voice thin and crackling over the radio, using language so formal that many could barely understand him. But the message was clear. The war was lost. The divine wind had not come. The promised victory had been a lie. Now the Americans were coming to occupy, to control, to reshape Japan into something they deemed acceptable. The propaganda had prepared the civilians for this moment. For years they had been told what to expect when the enemy soldiers arrived. The Americans were barbarians. They were demons in human skin. They were creatures without honor, without mercy, without any understanding of what it meant to be civilized. They would rape the women. They would torture the men. They would dash children against walls for sport. They would humiliate and degrade and destroy everything that made Japanese people Japanese. Better to die than to face them. Better to take your own life, to take your children's lives, than to endure what the demons would do when they came. Some had believed this completely. In the cities, entire families had jumped from buildings. In the countryside, mothers had taken their children and walked into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves rather than face the coming horror. Some had drunk poison. Some had opened their veins. Some had chosen the honor of death over the shame of surrender and occupation. The newspapers, what remained of them, did not report these deaths. But everyone knew. Everyone had heard stories. Everyone understood that for many, the end of the war meant the end of everything. But most people had simply waited, too tired to move, too hungry to care, their fear dulled by exhaustion and the basic mathematics of survival. Whatever the Americans did to them could not be worse than starving slowly in the ruins of their homes. Death by violence would at least be quick. Death by hunger was a slow grinding away of everything that made you human, until only a shell remained, and then even the shell crumbled. Mrs. Takahashi had considered it, walking into the sea. She had stood at the water's edge with her daughter in her arms and looked out at the horizon and thought about how easy it would be, how peaceful. Just walk until the water closed over your head, until the struggle ended, until you and your child could be together in whatever came after, free from hunger, free from fear, free from the terrible burden of trying to survive in a world that had become unsurvivable. But she had turned back, not because she was brave, not because she had hope. She had turned back because she was too tired to walk into the ocean, and because some stupid animal part of her brain still insisted that as long as you were breathing, you should keep breathing, even when breathing hurt, even when every breath was a betrayal of those who had already given up. The trucks arrived on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Takahashi heard them first. The sound of engines, heavy and mechanical, rolling through streets that had known only silence for weeks. The sound came from the east, from the direction of Yokohama, growing louder, closer, inevitable. She pulled her daughter closer, felt the child's heartbeat against her ribs, fast and weak, like a trapped bird. Around her, other women were reacting. Some were gathering their children, pulling them into houses, into closets, into the dark spaces where Americans might not find them. Some were crying. Some were praying to gods who had proven themselves absent or indifferent. Some simply stood frozen, waiting for whatever came next, their faces blank with resignation. Mrs. Takahashi's neighbor, Mrs. Ito, appeared in her doorway. She was 45, but looked 70, her hair white, her face a landscape of lines and shadows. She had 2 sons. Both had died in the war, one at Guadalcanal, one at Okinawa. She had received the notices within 3 weeks of each other. She had not smiled since. Now she looked at Mrs. Takahashi with eyes that held no fear because they held nothing at all. "They're here," she said. "Just that, they're here," as if she were announcing rain. The trucks stopped in the village square. 6 of them. Large military vehicles, olive green, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. American soldiers climbed out. 30 of them, maybe 40. Young men, most of them. Boys who should have been in college or working on farms or courting girls in small American towns. Instead, they were here, on the other side of the world, wearing uniforms that looked impossibly clean, impossibly whole. They carried rifles slung over their shoulders. They carried boxes. They moved with purpose. They spoke to each other in a language that sounded harsh and angular, nothing like Japanese, nothing that could be understood or predicted. They moved with the casual confidence of victors, of men who had won and knew it, who had earned the right to do whatever they pleased. Mrs. Takahashi watched from a broken window. Her hands were shaking. Her daughter whimpered quietly against her chest. She whispered to the child to be silent, to be invisible, to simply not exist until these men left and took their violence with them. She could see other faces in other windows now, pale and frightened, watching, waiting. The village held its breath.
She waited for the screaming to start. She waited for the gunfire. She waited for soldiers to kick down doors and drag women into the street. She waited for the world to end in the way she had been promised it would end, in the way that seemed inevitable, in the way that would at least provide the grim satisfaction of proving the propaganda correct. But the soldiers were unloading the boxes. One of them, a tall man with red hair and sunburned skin that marked him as a farmer or someone who worked outdoors, lifted a wooden crate from the back of a truck and set it on the ground. The crate was heavy. She could tell by the way he moved, by the effort it took. Another soldier, shorter, darker-haired, opened it with a knife. Mrs. Takahashi could not see what was inside from her position, but she watched as more soldiers began moving more crates, organizing them into rows in the center of the square. They worked with the efficiency of men following a plan, men who had done this before. An officer was speaking to them, gesturing, pointing to different areas of the square. The soldiers nodded. They moved without aggression. They looked almost bored, like men performing a routine task, something they had done 100 times and would do 100 times more. Then one of them called out, in Japanese. The accent was terrible, the pronunciation mangled, but it was definitely Japanese. Food, he said. The word cut through the silence like a blade. Food for children. Food. Mrs. Takahashi felt her heart stop. Around her she heard gasps, whispers, the sound of people trying to process something that made no sense. Food. The Americans were saying food. They were saying children. She looked around. Other faces appeared in other windows, other women, other mothers drawn by the word that meant more than any other word could mean. Food. The soldier said it again. Children, food, come. He was gesturing to the crates, to the boxes, motioning for people to come forward with his hands. The movement was slow, non-threatening, the way you would try to coax a frightened animal. No one moved. The fear was too deep, too total, carved into their bones by years of propaganda. It had to be a trick. It had to be a trap. The demons were clever. They would lure the children out, and then a child broke from a doorway. A boy, maybe 6 years old, wearing rags that had once been clothes. Too hungry to be afraid anymore. Too young to have absorbed the full weight of the propaganda. Moving on pure instinct toward the word food, the way a dying man moves toward water. His mother screamed, a sound that was more animal than human, tried to grab him, missed. The boy ran into the square, on legs that barely held him, stumbling, catching himself, driven by a hunger that overrode every other impulse. He stopped in front of the tall man with red hair and sunburned skin that marked him as a farmer or someone who worked outdoors. He looked up at him with eyes that expected death but hoped for something else, something impossible. The square went silent. Every soldier stopped moving. Every hidden civilian held their breath. The moment stretched, expanded, became enormous. Everything depended on what happened next. The soldier knelt down, slowly, carefully, moving the way you would move around something precious and breakable. He unslung his rifle and set it on the ground, away from him, away from the boy. Then he reached into one of the crates and pulled out a can, metal, with a label in English. He opened it with a tool from his belt, a small can opener. The sound of metal cutting metal. The smell hit the air. Meat, rich and heavy and impossibly real. Mrs. Takahashi could smell it from her window. Her mouth flooded with saliva, her stomach cramped with want. The soldier scooped some of the meat onto his fingers. He held it out to the boy. The child stared at it, stared at the soldier, did not move, did not trust. "Eat," the soldier said in his broken Japanese. "Good, eat." He smiled. It was not a cruel smile, not predatory, just tired and kind and human. The boy ate. He grabbed the soldier's hand and ate like an animal, all caution dissolved by hunger, by need, by the fundamental drive to survive. He devoured what was on the soldier's fingers and looked up with eyes that begged for more. The soldier laughed, a sound of surprise and sadness mixed together, and opened another can. He handed it to the boy directly, the whole can, gesturing for him to take it. The boy clutched it to his chest like treasure and ran back toward where his mother was sobbing in a doorway. And then the dam broke. Children appeared from everywhere, stumbling out of houses, crawling from under debris, carried by mothers who no longer cared about fear because their babies were dying and nothing else mattered anymore. They came into the square in a flood, dozens of them small gray figures with enormous eyes and stick-thin limbs. And the American soldiers moved among them, opening cans, opening boxes, handing out food with hands that were gentle, voices that were soft. They knelt to be at the children's level. They smiled. They made no demands. They asked for nothing in return. They simply gave. Mrs. Takahashi stood at her window and watched a soldier, young, maybe 19, with dark skin and kind eyes, hand a can to a little girl no older than her daughter. The girl took it with both hands, bowed instinctively, the gesture so automatic it required no thought. And the soldier bowed back. He bowed back. An American soldier, a member of the army that had firebombed Tokyo, that had killed hundreds of thousands, that had won the war and could do anything they wanted, bowing to a Japanese child in respect, in recognition, in acknowledgement of her humanity and his own. Mrs. Takahashi's legs gave out. She slid down the wall, her daughter still in her arms, and something broke inside her chest. Not her heart, something deeper. The machinery of hate that had been installed there by years of propaganda, by speeches and posters and radio broadcasts that told her who to fear and who to blame and who deserved to die. It shattered. It fell away like rust flaking off metal, and what remained was confusion and grief and a terrible, overwhelming gratitude that felt like drowning, that felt like being unmade and remade into something different, something she did not have words for. She looked down at her daughter. The child was staring at her with those two large eyes. "Mama, food?" Mrs. Takahashi stood. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely walk. But she walked anyway, carrying her daughter, stepping out of her house for the first time in days, moving into the square where demons were feeding children. A young soldier saw her coming, saw the child in her arms, saw how thin the child was, how close to death, and his face changed. The casual efficiency vanished, replaced by something urgent and almost frightened. He moved toward her quickly, calling to another soldier in English. Together, they guided her to a crate, had her sit down. One of them was opening cans, 3, 4, 5. The other was trying to communicate, pointing to his mouth, mimicking eating, his face concerned, almost panicked by how thin the child was, by how obvious it was that this little girl was dying. Mrs. Takahashi took the cans. She looked up at these men, these enemies, these demons who were feeding her daughter, who were saving her daughter's life, who were giving away their own food to children that belonged to a nation that had tried to kill them. She tried to speak, tried to say thank you. No words came, only tears. They ran down her face, and she could not stop them.
She bowed her head, and the tears fell onto her daughter's hair. And the soldiers stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to do with this grief, this gratitude, this breaking. Just young men far from home trying to do something good in a world that had been full of nothing but evil for longer than they could remember. One of the soldiers, the one with dark skin and kind eyes, pulled something from his pocket, a photograph. He showed it to her. A woman, 2 small children, his family. He pointed to the children in the photograph, then to Mrs. Takahashi's daughter. "Same," he said in English. Then, in broken Japanese, "Children, all children, same." Mrs. Takahashi understood. Not the words, the meaning beneath the words. This soldier had children. This soldier understood what it meant to be a parent. This soldier was feeding her daughter because he could not imagine not feeding a child, any child, even an enemy child. Because children were not enemies. Children were just children. The food distribution continued for hours. The Americans worked tirelessly, opening crates, distributing cans, making sure every child received something. They brought out bags of rice, powdered milk, chocolate bars that the children had never seen before. They set up a field kitchen and began cooking soup in enormous pots, thick with vegetables and meat, the smell so powerful it made people dizzy. They served it in lines where Japanese civilians stood next to American soldiers and ate from the same pot, drank from the same water.
The Americans always fed the children first. They insisted on it. They would not eat until every child had been given something, until every mother had something to take home. When an old man tried to give his portion to a young woman with a baby, the Americans intervened, gently but firmly, making sure the old man ate. When a mother tried to refuse food for herself, taking only for her children, the soldiers physically placed cans in her hands, would not let her leave without them. Mrs. Takahashi watched all of this with a mind that felt broken open, that could no longer process what she was seeing according to the old rules, the old understanding. These were not demons. These were not barbarians. These were men, tired, young men who missed their families and wanted to go home, but who in the meantime were trying to make things a little less terrible in the small corner of the world where they had been placed. She fed her daughter slowly, carefully, knowing that a stomach too long empty could not handle too much food at once. The child ate and then fell asleep in her arms. Truly asleep, not the half-conscious stupor of starvation, but actual sleep, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. Mrs. Takahashi held her and wept, and could not stop weeping because her daughter was going to live. Her daughter was going to live. The food distribution continued for days. Every morning the trucks came. Every morning the soldiers brought supplies, they brought medicine, they brought blankets, they brought soap and bandages and vitamins. They set up a clinic where a young American medic with gentle hands examined children, gave them shots, treated their malnutrition and their diseases with a care and attention that seemed impossible given that these had been enemy children just weeks before. The village began to change, slowly, carefully. The fear began to recede, like a tide going out. Children started approaching the soldiers without terror. They learned English words, hello, and thank you, and candy, and the soldiers learned Japanese words in return. Women began to smile, tentative at first, then more freely. The Americans taught some of the village boys to play baseball, using sticks and a ball made of wrapped cloth. They showed photographs of their own families, their own children, their own homes in places called Iowa and Georgia and California. They shared cigarettes with the old men. They helped repair damaged houses. They worked alongside the villagers, sweating in the heat, their uniforms getting dirty, their hands getting blistered. One afternoon, Mrs. Takahashi was working in what remained of her garden, trying to coax some vegetables to grow in soil that had been picked clean. The red-haired soldier, the first one, the one who had fed the first child, approached.
He said something in English, then tried in Japanese. "Help?" He gestured to the garden, to the tools, offering. Mrs. Takahashi hesitated, then nodded. They worked together in silence for an hour. He was strong, good with his hands, clearly someone who had worked a farm before. He helped her turn the soil, plant seeds that the Americans had brought. At one point, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same tool. Mrs. Takahashi pulled back instinctively, but the soldier just smiled, handed her the tool, and went back to digging. When they finished, he pulled something from his pack, a small photograph, creased and worn. A farm, rolling fields, a barn, a woman standing in front of it waving. He pointed to the woman, to himself, wife. Then he pointed to the fields, made a planting gesture, pointed to the garden they had just worked. Same. Farm. Home. Mrs. Takahashi understood. This man was a farmer, like her husband had been before the war took him. This man understood the earth, understood growing things, understood the patience required to put seeds in the ground and trust that they would become food. He was not a demon. He was a farmer in a soldier's uniform, doing what he could with what he had been given. She bowed to him, deeply, formally, the bow you give to someone who has shown you great kindness. He looked surprised, then bowed back, awkward but sincere. The weeks passed. The village began to recover. Not quickly, not completely. The damage was too deep for that. But children stopped dying. People began to gain weight. Color returned to faces. Laughter became possible again. The Americans continued their work, continued bringing supplies, continued treating the villagers not as conquered enemies, but as people who needed help, people who deserved help, people whose suffering mattered. Mrs. Takahashi's daughter began to play again, to run, to laugh. She followed the American soldiers around like a puppy, and they indulged her, taught her games, gave her candy, ruffled her hair with hands that could have hurt but chose not to. Mrs. Takahashi watched this and felt emotions she could not name. Gratitude and shame and confusion and a kind of grief for all the years she had spent believing lies about these men, about their country, about what they were capable of. One evening, as the sun was setting, Mrs. Takahashi stood at the edge of the village and watched the American soldiers playing baseball with the village children. The red-haired farmer was pitching, his movements gentle, lobbing the ball slowly so the children could hit it. When a small boy connected and sent the ball flying, the soldier cheered as if it were the greatest thing he had ever seen. The children were laughing, the soldiers were laughing, and for a moment, just a moment, it was possible to forget that these men had been enemies, that a war had been fought, that thousands had died in hatred and fury. For a moment, there were just human beings playing a game in the fading light, finding joy in a world that had tried very hard to eliminate all joy. Mrs. Ito came to stand beside her, the woman who had lost both sons, the woman whose eyes had been empty. She watched the baseball game in silence for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, almost wondering. "They are not what we were told," she said. "No," Mrs. Takahashi agreed. "They are feeding our children. They are helping us rebuild. They are—" She paused, searching for words. "They are kind." Mrs. Takahashi nodded. She thought about the propaganda, about the years of being told that Americans were monsters. She thought about how easily she had believed it, how completely she had accepted that the enemy was something less than human. But they were people. They had always been people. Young men who missed their families, who were tired of war, who would rather be planting fields than carrying guns. Men who saw hungry children and could not help but feed them, because that was what decent people did, regardless of nationality, regardless of which side had won or lost. men who bowed to old women and played with children and worked in gardens, because those were the actions of human beings trying to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The propaganda had lied about everything. The demons had turned out to be human. The barbarians had turned out to have honor. The enemy had turned out to be capable of mercy. This knowledge was almost harder to bear than the hunger had been, because it meant that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, everything their sons and husbands and brothers had died for, all of it had been built on lies. The war had been real, but the reasons for it had been false. The suffering had been genuine, but the certainty that had justified it had been manufactured. They had been manipulated into hating people who were not hateful, into fearing people who were not fearsome, into supporting a war that had destroyed millions of lives for nothing, for abstractions, for the ambitions of men who had sent other men to die, while they themselves remained safe. But it also meant something else. It meant that the world was not as dark as they had been told. It meant that kindness could exist even between enemies. It meant that a soldier could cross an ocean to fight you, and then, when the fighting was finished, kneel down and feed your child before he fed himself. It meant that the human capacity for compassion was stronger than the human capacity for hate, that the impulse to help was more fundamental than the impulse to harm. It meant that the future, whatever it held, did not have to be built on the same lies that had created the past. Mrs. Takahashi never forgot the face of the red-haired soldier who had fed that first boy. She never forgot the way he had smiled, the way he had been gentle, the way he had treated Japanese children as if they mattered, as if their lives had value, as if the war had not made them less than human. She told her daughter about it when she was older. She told her grandchildren. She told the story until the day she died, not because it was dramatic or exciting, but because it was true, and because truth was the only thing that could begin to heal what the war had broken. The Americans eventually left. The occupation ended. Life continued. Mrs. Takahashi's daughter grew up, got married, had children of her own. The village rebuilt. The scars faded, though they never disappeared completely. Japan changed, transformed itself, became something different than it had been. The war became history, became textbooks and documentaries and the fading memories of old people. But some things remained. Some lessons, once learned, could not be unlearned. Mrs. Takahashi taught her daughter, and her daughter taught her children, that the enemy was never who they said it was, that the people you were told to hate were just people, human and flawed and capable of both cruelty and kindness, that war was a failure of imagination, a failure to see the humanity in those on the other side, that the most powerful force in the world was not bombs or bullets, but the simple act of feeding a hungry child, of showing mercy when you could have shown cruelty, of choosing kindness when hate would have been easier. The war had taught them to hate. A simple act of feeding hungry children taught them that hate was a choice, not a destiny. And some choices, once seen clearly, become impossible to make again. The American soldiers had won the war with their machines and their weapons and their superior numbers, but they had won something more important with their kindness. They had won the future. They had shown that enemies could become something else, that the cycle of hatred and revenge could be broken, that the world could be rebuilt not on the ashes of the past, but on the foundation of compassion, of seeing the humanity in all people, even those who had tried to kill you. Mrs. Takahashi died in 1989, an old woman in a country that had become peaceful and prosperous. On her deathbed, her daughter asked her what she remembered most clearly from her long life. There were many moments to choose from: her wedding day, the birth of her children, the slow recovery of Japan from the ashes of defeat. But the answer came without hesitation. "An American soldier," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Red hair, farmer's hands. He knelt in the dirt and fed a hungry child. And I understood that the world was different than I had been told. That people were different. That there was hope." She died that night, peacefully. And her last thoughts were not of hunger or fear or the terrible years of war, but of a moment in a village square when the future had announced itself, not with trumpets or declarations, but with the simple act of one human being showing kindness to another. That moment had changed everything. That moment had proven that the capacity for compassion was stronger than the machinery of hate. That moment had shown that even after the worst that humanity could do to itself, there was still a path forward, still a way to build something better. The lesson remained, the story remained, and in the telling and retelling, in the passing down from generation to generation, the truth remained that kindness can be more powerful than victory, that mercy can be more transformative than conquest, and that the simple act of feeding a hungry child can change the world in ways that armies never could.